Hi, this is BenCB for Razor Edge, and in today's video we'll talk about pushing. At first we will talk about typical mistakes, then I will show you when and how you should differ from Nash. I will show you when it's appropriate to push and when it's appropriate to min-raise, and what are the advantages from the min-raise. And as the last point, we look into situations when we are a short stack, so we have less than 6 big blinds. In this video you should learn how to play your ranges in the different spots with different stack sizes, and that you reduce your mistakes to a minimum. As a border, what you can push, you can use the principle of the 3-card range. I will go into more detail later on. We have the problem that ranges are too static in my opinion, and that's a huge leak. That's because many players only play the Nash ranges, and when they review hands they only look if the push or the Nash push or not. I experienced this with many players, that they invest a lot of time in ICM spots, in reviewing hands, in marking hands, but most of the time they only look at the Nash ranges in the review, and they are really fit in this topic, but they lose value cause they play stubborn according to Nash. Nowadays you should make huge adaptations, and Nash ranges are often insufficient. Another huge leak is that they are too tight in blind versus blind situations, especially against the fish with stack sizes around 10 big blinds. We will look at a few examples later on. Another leak is that many players are too tight in middle position and on the cutoff, especially with higher blinds, and when they are the short stack they make too many folds. It is often worthwhile to push loser, but then players tend to shove very marginal hands when they are deep, so with 13 big blinds or more. Often we can play these spots differently and increase our ROI, and often the view on the other stack size is insufficient. Some players make it very superficial, and there are situations in which this is super important. We will look at this in detail later on. And I wrote down that many players ISO shove too tight. That's not a spot to print a lot of money, cause we only isolate shorter stacks, but the other points are more important, cause the mistakes are larger and they have a higher impact on our win rate. What you should remember is that the Nash ranges are only a tool for a sit and go player, but not the finished home. Nash will not make you to a winning player when you only play according to Nash, so you play solid in the early game and make very few mistakes, and in the late game you play stubborn according to Nash, then you will not be a huge winning player nowadays, cause it is important to think outside the box, especially in the hyper turbo sit and goes. When the stacks are very short we should make some huge adaptations. The Nash ranges are only orientation or a framework, and we can work with these. We should nearly never open shove more than 15 big blinds. There are some situations in which we have to, and we will look into detail later on. It is always important to look at the stack sizes in comparison to the blinds. When we have in the early game 8 big blinds with 15-30 blinds, we have less full equity in comparison to 8 big blinds with 40-80 blinds, cause we have a bigger stack and more full equity. So it is important to look at your stack size in relativity to the blinds, cause weaker players or a fish don't pay attention to this, or they adapt in a wrong way. Let's assume we have 8 big blinds with 10-20 blinds, then they call way lighter cause it looks less, and they call way tighter with 15-30 blinds cause the stacks get bigger, This makes some sense, but often fish make really sick adaptions, and they don't understand the relativity of the blinds in comparison to the stack size. When you have many hands with a regular, let's say 1k hands or more, and you never saw a Nash call or a very loose call, then you should push very loose against this player. Especially on the lower limits and at the mid stakes are many players that can't call according to Nash, and we should abuse this league. Many good winning players abuse this, and this occurs on the higher stakes also, because often some MTT players want to try some hypers and call in many spots too tight, in which they should call loose, and then they call on the bubble too loose. So they make mistakes with their calling ranges, and we should abuse this. So when you see a very close Nash call, it is important to note it, cause in the future you can make some really sick adaptions and increase your win rate when you select the players which never call according to Nash. Cause you can jam all the time and then just print money. And now we look at the different positions in detail, and we start with the small blind. I will show you on which things you have to pay attention to and how we should differ our play. And after that we look into some example hands. Okay, let's start with the small blind. With 5 to 10 big blinds against a fish or an unknown, we can push close to 100%. Of course, there are exceptions when we have a high bubble factor or villain has a huge stack. When the blinds are 1530 and we have 300 chips, and our villain has 1000 chips, we should push according to Nash. But when we can cripple our opponent or we cover him, then we should shove any two against the fish. I will show you this later in the calculator, cause these players call too tight, and around 10 big blinds we should also push Luther than Nash against other regulars, cause on the lower stakes to the mid stakes, I would say up to $100, most of the racks call too tight. That's in my opinion another difference between mid stakes and high stakes racks, cause on the mid stakes most racks are unable to call that loose, and that's why it is important that you note it when you see that a rack calls according to Nash or even looser than Nash. And with this way you will find the racks which are calling too tight. There are some situations in which we are the mid stack and we play against a loose chip lead rack or chip lead fish, then we should shove tighter when we are on the bubble or forehanded. But there are racks which call very tight even when they are the chip leader, cause they don't want to risk their chip lead, and with 12 or 13 big blinds many racks don't have all the ICM basics in their head, cause they think ace x is always a call and snap call with ace x on the bubble. And on the bubble with 12 or 13 big blinds, this is relatively deep for this stage, and when they call ace-x hands we can't push any two. Sometimes we have to push tighter than Nash is telling us. There are weak racks which have a little ICM knowledge and know the Nash ranges, but they call too loose in the wrong spots, and you have to pay attention to this. The reason is not their ego, they just don't know better, and you have to live with it, and you should adapt against those players. Okay, we will change our strategy a little bit. I will show you example hands after every position. I think that's better to understand for you, and you have the theory right in your head, and we can start with some example hands. Okay, let's start with the first hand. We are 6-handed and we are in the small blind with 9-6 suited. The big blind was a fish, and we take a closer look which hands we should shove in this spot. We have 10 big blinds And now we give him a range what he is definitely calling with. So the average fish, I would say, I think the average player calls this 30% range, and in the one or another case the range can be tighter, cause the stack size is 10 big blinds, so our villain is not desperate. If he is calling King 8, King 9, King 4 suited, King 5 suited, I think it is possible, but I think rather not. So when the range is different, the range will be tighter. Sure, there will be a player which calls a hand like Jack 9 suited or 8 9 suited or Queen 8 suited. I'll not exclude that. And now we will look into the situation with 3 deuce offsuit, and we see that the shove is very profitable. When we think about the worst case, we have a break even or slightly minus EV shove, and I think under normal circumstances it is good plus EV, and I think 30.2 or 28.5 are realistic. And then it's super profitable. That's what I talked about earlier. You should shove any 2 against the recreational player all day long, but when his stack is bigger, let's give him 600 chips. The EV doesn't change, but I think he's calling the one or another hand more, and that's why I would shove 10% less. That sounds very good. So we should shove a 90% range against a bigger stack. When he's even more chips, let's give him 20 big blinds, then I think it is possible that he calls even loser, but you can see that we can push loser than Nash. So here we have the Nash range, and you can see that we can shove 65.6%, and when you only push this range, you leave so much money on the table. And this calling range is total unrealistic for a fish. He's never calling with Queen 8 or 10-9 offsuit, and that's a spot in which we should adapt very hard. We should widen our range at least by 20 to 30%. When the fish plays the first hands with an 80-80 style, then we can shove tighter, but normally that's not the case. Let's move on to the next situation. We are four-handed and we shove against the second chip leader. I want to show you the situation when you play against a weak regular. So when he don't really know what he can call, and there are regulars which are not aware of the bubble factor four-handed. We have a clear any 2 spot. When he is a chip leader, I think he's calling with King Jack, King 10, King 9. I think he's folding deuces and trays, but there are racks which call ace deuce and pocket deuces and pocket threes. When you saw a call once, you should really watch out, cause they don't make it to annoy you, but we have to push tighter then. So from 100 to 65%, and these spots happen very often. We have to think if we want to put those hands into our min raising or into our completing range, and I want to explain you the idea of the 3 card range with this example, because many players go crazy when they don't really know what they can push. I'm not trying to memorize this chart. I see, oh, King 4 is a fold, King 5 is close, and King 6 is a clear push. There's no sit and go player in the world who knows the exact shoving range, but when you know that you can push 9-6 offsuit and you would fold 9-5 offsuit and 9-7 offsuit is a clear push, when you try to work this way, you will be more confident in those spots, and when you review and you see, oh, 9-6 was a fold and 9-7 is just a close push, then you are in the 3 card range. The same applies to your calling range. Which hands can we call from these 3 hands? We make this dependent on other factors. So do we have a high future EV? Are we the chip leader when we win? Do we bust a regular or a fish with this call? So it is better to call loser against a regular than against the fish. That's important for our in-game table selection. We want to bust the regulars that we can play with the fish. And we include these factors in our decision, and then we decide which hands we call of these three hands. Here we have another situation with 11 big blinds against a fun player. In this case I had stats, and on the first 8 hands he played 60-40. I use these stats cause I don't think I can complete a lot of hands against him. The same applies to my min raise. He will call a lot, 3-bet a lot, and push a lot. We have a clear push with queen 6, and according to Nash we can shove queen 5 also. I will show you that we can shove nearly any two with 11 big blinds, cause we are 11 big blinds deep. I don't think that he is calling this 30% range. I think he's calling a bit tighter, but when we give him the 30%, then we can push super loose. Let's look at the EV when we shove 6-3 offsuit, and yeah, the EV is break even and we shouldn't shove in this spot. With 11 big blinds, I think he's calling more 28% range. I think it is close if he's calling king 6 suited or deuces or king 9 offsuit. And then we can shove nearly any two, and you should do this. In the last hand we play against a fun player and we have a weak junk hand. At first we look at the Nash range that we have a framework, then we look at the calling range, and that's so unrealistic. The good thing is that we only have 8 big blinds, so our risk reward ratio is very good. And in these spots most fun players call way too tight. I think the calling range is at most 26%. I see those loose calls so rarely, and it is so profitable to push any two in this spot. And I think many racks are too tight in this spot, and you should abuse this till they call you light, and then you can shove normal ranges or even tighter ranges. So he has to call 32% that 3 deuce offsuit is a minus EV shove. And you have the option to look when a hand is going to be minus EV. As you can see, when he calls more than 32%, our shove is minus EV. So there are situations in which we should shove way looser than Nash, but there are also situations in which we have to shove very tight from the small blind. Let's look a bit closer into the button. I think it is often very profitable, especially within 6 to 9 big blinds, to push very loose when you are 5 or 6 handed. An exception is when we are the mid stack and the blinds are very high. So the blinds are 60, 120, so we are often the mid stack cause the other players have very often 2 or 3 big blind stacks. Especially on the button we can establish a min raise strategy against many opponent types. And the third point is really important. As a mid stack or second chip leader we should shove tighter on the button. But I made an extra video to this topic. So just look this video cause so many players make huge mistakes in this spot. Four-handed, it is important to take the collusion probability into account. So how high is the probability that two players play against each other and bust the other player, and we are one place closer to the money? That's especially the case when regulars are behind us, cause regulars push loser and call loser, so they bust each other more often than when a fish is behind. And it's important to look at the stack sizes in relativity to the blinds. So a 7 big blind stack with 15-30 blinds generate less full equity than a 7 big blind stack with 40-80 or 50-100 blinds. Cause so many players just look at their chart, oh 8 big blinds on the button, I shove this range, but they don't look at their stack size in relativity to the other stack sizes and make huge mistakes. Okay, let's look into a few situations. First hand, we have Jack 7 suited on the button. At first we look at the Nash range, and according to Nash we can push 36.7%. Jack 7 is a push. I think per default I would push a little bit looser than Nash, but we learned to look at the stacks in correlation to the other stacks. So don't just think, oh, I have 8 or 9 big blinds, I should push loose. Look at the stacks of the blinds, and in the big blind was a fish, and in those spots they often call lighter cause our stack don't hurt him when he lose. I gave him this 28% calling range, and I think that's not unrealistic, and here this player calls 21%. I think that's reasonable. It is possible that he is also shoving looser or tighter, and you can see that we shouldn't push too loose. When the blinds are higher, it's a different story. When the blinds are 20-40, we would have 360 chips, then we would have more full equity than with this stack, and Jack 7 is the bottom end of my shoving range. I found an interesting small blind spot which I wanted to show you now. We have the situation that we are the mid stack and we have one chip leader, and I see it very often that many players push too loose in the spot. He should call this range according to Nash. I think he's calling King 9 suited and King 10 for sure. I think he's folding deuces. He's folding ace deuce and ace tray. So the 22.6% are okay, I think. I think many players shove the 63% range, and with Queen 8 we have a close push. There are fun players which call Queen 10 and Jack 10 when they are the chip leader, or King 9, King 8 suited, and when he calls Queen Jack offsuit, it is very fast minus EV. So the maximum he is allowed to call is 22-23%, and that's questionable. Many fun players call too loose in those spots. Here we have a similar scenario. The big blind was a huge fish. We have ace 4 offsuit with 12 big blinds, and most players just jam this hand pre-flop. It's a clear Nash jam, but we should differ a lot from Nash in this spot and fold a few ace-x hands. When we look at the calling range, this range looks very optimistic, because I think he's calling with hands like King Queen, King Jack or King 10 for sure. So I think this range will be more like 16%, and then we can only shove this range. So we should decrease our 28% range to a 10% range, and I folded ace 4. I was not so sure in game, but I was aware of the fact that this hand will be minus EV when he is calling a bit looser. Let's move on with the button hands. We have a very interesting spot with 10-7 offsuit. We have a good stack for this blind stage. We have good fold equity against everyone. When we fold now, we have the problem that we have very low fold equity against seat 1, seat 2 and seat 3. They are nearly committed when they are in the big blind, and we can shove looser than Nash. Now let's look what they call against our push. I give this player a 40% range, but I don't think that's realistic, and I give the small blind a 30% calling range. It is important when you work with the wizard that you set the first in range for every player. Normally I work with the Hold'em resource calculator, and as you can see, in the worst case it is just a little bit minus EV, but I think he's calling only a 35% range, and the small blind will also call a bit tighter and then we have a very profitable spot and we can push very wide. And we should differ from Nash. Nash wants to jam 33.6%. That's why a big blind calling range of an unknown is total unrealistic. He's never calling with queen deuce suited. So when you transfer yourself in this spot and ask yourself if you are calling queen deuce suited, or a hand like 8-7 offsuit or 10-6 suited, and a fun player is definitely folding. A reg will call a bit lighter, that's why I wouldn't shove 72%, but I think we should shove around 50-60%. And these spots are important when the blinds are high, that you take those spots. Even when it's slightly minus EV, we should take this spot, cause after that we can push very loose and we have to wait for a hand. And when we take down this pot, we have a nice stack and we can wait a little bit. It is important that you watch the video Collusion Likelihood on the button. The video is about the bubble and this topic is really important. In the video I talk about many bubble spots on the button. That's why I will not talk about those spots in this video. Let's move on with the cutoff. I wrote down a schedule when you face a tough decision and you don't know if this hand is a shove or not. The most important point is to consider the players behind you. Are they tight? Are they loose? And their stack sizes. And you have to see this with one quick view, 1 second, and you have to estimate the situation. The second important point is your own image. Have you pushed the hands before? When this is the case, you should push according to Nash or even tighter. Then has your push or your fold an impact on your future EV? Can you overtake the chip lead? If that's the case, you can push loser. When you can't overtake the chip lead, you can look how soft is the table. When there are only regulars, we take the close spot, and when the table is rather soft, we should skip this spot and just fold our hand. When you have just 5 or 6 big blinds, this plays no major role. We talk about situations with 9 to 12 big blinds. So you can get a better spot in the future, and when there are many fish at your table, the possibility that you get a walk increases, cause most fun players shove a bit tighter. There's one very important spot. When we are forehanded on the cutoff and we are the mid stack, in this spot we have to play very tight ranges, sometimes even tighter than Nash. But 5 or 6 handed between 6 and 10 big blinds, with higher blinds we can push way looser than Nash. There are spots which most mid-stakes regs don't take up on, and especially on the lower stakes we can play loser ranges. Let's look into a few cutoff scenarios now. We have 9-8 offsuit with 40-80 blinds, so we have 5.5 big blinds. Let's look at the ranges first. I think the big blind is calling a bit lighter, especially with his stack. Yes, 20% for the button is okay, I think. And I think the small blind will shove a bit looser with his stack. 22% is realistic. The good thing is the stack constellation. The button and the small blind have enough big blinds that they are not forced to go all in with trash hands. The same applies to the big blind, and we look at the Nash range for the cutoff, and he suggests a 35% range. Also, he suggests a tighter button calling range. Okay, the small blind has a 26% calling range. We can do that, but I see it very rarely that they get it in with the weak aces. And the big blind is calling with a 35% range. I think that's total unrealistic. I don't think anyone is calling there with the king 3 suited, but we can set the range to 28%, and then we see that we can shove 10% lighter, and the reason is that the players don't call that loose against our shove. And when we give the button a looser calling range, then we can shove 3% looser than Nash suggests. So we should push very loose in this spot, and we should take every plus EV situation, cause we are so short. When we are under 6 big blinds, we should take every spot we can, cause there are not a lot of better spots in the future. Especially when we see that we have to push in 2 hands into the big stack, so we can push that loose against him. And as I told you, I think it is more likely that he calls a bit tighter against our shove. When you have the read that a maniac is behind you that calls very light, let's say 30%, but even then we can push 4% looser than Nash, and you should take those spots. Here you can see which hands you can shove with, and that's very loose. So when you have often the situation that you blind out or get super short, maybe you have the leak that you push too tight, but when a regular calls you very light, you have to keep an eye on him. I would not advise you to push according to Nash after you saw a loose call. I would continue to push very loose, but when he calls again very light, then I would adjust my ranges. I push in these spots very loose too, and some racks called me very light, and then I started to push according to Nash. I just marked the player, calls loose against the cutoff push, and then it's not a problem. You can create very clear badges for this situation. I showed you the badges in my free introduction video, cause you may ask yourself, when I note all those spots, I have so many notes and it's totally confusing. Then you can create your individual badge, and Chris can show you how this works, or I can show it to you. So I can create a badge called loose against late position, and then you know right away, and you don't have to look in the note window. So before you push, you see, oh, this player calls loose against the late open, so I should push tighter. Let's move on to the next hand. We have ace of offsuit with 10 big blinds on the cutoff, and we are a mid stack, and we have the situation that the button and the small blind are regulars, and the big blind is a fun player. Now we look which hands we can shove. I gave the button a 10% calling range, the small blind 7.6%, and the big blind 25%. I think that's realistic. These are the first in ranges, so the small blind is shoving 74%, but I think that most racks can shove any 2. But I give him 85% cause some racks don't know that they can shove any 2 in this spot. Or let's give him 100% cause I think it's a bit more realistic, and then we see what happens. Cause I wanted to show you how tight we have to push on the cutoff. I think the calling ranges are right, and the button, I think he can fold pocket fours, especially hands like ace deuce suited and deuces look like a no-brainer shove, but that's not correct. We can only push half of the Nash range, and that's a scenario which happens all the time when we are the mid stack four-handed and we have regulars behind which can shove first in, so not in the big blind. So when the regulars are on the button or in the small blind, cause they push first in losers and fun players, and that's the reason why our EV goes down. When we replace this player with a fish that's only shoving 50%, and that's another fish which only shoves 28% instead of 36% from the button. After that we can see that we can push loser now. We see that we can shove 7% loser after that, and that's considerable. And that's a situation in which a min-raise strategy is a good option to fold against the small blind and we are not the chip leader with this shove, so there's no future EV. When we had 880 or 900 chips, then we're even with the chip leader. Then we can think about taking a slightly minus EV push, but in general, with 2 regulars on the button and in the small blind, we should be very tight, and it's realistic that the small blind is shoving any 2 and the button is a reg 2 and he's relatively short, and according to Nash he can shove 36%. When we give him a loser range, let's say 40%, then our range gets a bit tighter. Even hands like Queen 10 suited, King Jack, King 10, we have to fold now. So it is really important to look at the players behind you, and there are these 3 sub items. When you are unsure, you can make a better decision as when you just guess what's the right play. From middle position we have the identical guideline as on the cutoff, especially with 30-60 blinds and up we should push loser with the short stack. When we are on the hijack we are often 5-handed, and especially then we can push really loose. And we have to pay attention when the blinds are low with a stack size around 6 to 9 big blinds, cause we can shove that loose in this blind stage. Keyword relativity, cause we have less full equity against the other stacks. So don't say, oh, I have 7 big blinds, I shove this range, and with these blinds and 7 big blinds I shove the same range. This is insufficient nowadays. And it's an important point when you play against the fish. They don't look at their big blinds, they look at the overall stack size, and when they have 800 chips and you shove your 240 chips with 10-20 blinds or 15-30 blinds and you have 7-8 big blinds, they call you way lighter than with higher blinds, and you have to keep this in your mind. Let's look at a typical situation. We have 30-60 blinds and we are nearly the second chip lead, but we are a bit short with 7.5 big blinds. And now we look which hands we can shove. We will look into the situation when there's a reg on the cutoff and the situation when a fish is on the cutoff. Besides that, we don't think that a maniac caller is behind. Let's look at the Nash range at first, and we see that we can shove 5-6 suited. We can only push 30%. I gave the players a realistic calling range. When we have a regular behind, I think this calling range is realistic. The button is calling 11% according to Nash, and I gave him a 12% calling range. It is possible that he is calling this range. The small blind is isolating a 15% range, but I think most players are a bit tighter with the offsuit aces and only ISO shove hands like King Queen or King 10 suited. And if the big blind is calling with Ace 4 offsuit and Queen Jack suited, I mean, yes, that's possible. So even with an average stack, you can push loser than Nash. According to Nash, we can shove 29%, but we can shove 40%. But I'm not a huge fan of it. As I told you, we should just use every plus EV spot when we have around 7 big blinds, and you can see that we can shove very light, especially hands like King 9, Queen 9, 10 9, 9 8, 7 5 suited and 6 5 suited. We should definitely shove, and it is possible that the blinds go up after this hand, and that's super ugly for us. So especially when the blinds go up, we can take a slightly minus EV shove, cause it hurt our stack a lot when we have to pay the 120 chips. Okay, let's move on with Under the Gun. That's the only position where we almost every time should play according to Nash, cause there are so many players behind and it's possible that the one or another player is calling a bit looser. The calling ranges have to be very tight that we can shove looser than Nash. And when you table select and play with bad players, you have to pay attention and you can't push that loose. There are exceptions. When we are very short and we are on the edge to lose our full equity, we can push a bit looser, but here we can inculcate the Nash ranges, although I'm not the biggest fan of it. But we can't differ so much from the Nash ranges in Under the Gun. Let's move on to a controversial topic, and there are quite different opinions. I will show you my own standpoint. I think it is useful to push Ace King, Ace Queen with 11 to 13 big blinds, especially on stakes on which balancing is not that important. Often we only induce a re-steal from pocket pairs or Ace Queen or Ace Jack suited. Regulars don't rejam Ace 10 or Ace Jack offsuit. Even Ace Jack suited often flat calls, so we only induce a rejam from pocket pairs. And that's a problem, cause we don't want that. And we have the problem that a fish is going to flat us in position and we have to play a tough spot out of position, especially when we hit nothing or pre-flop a player and another player overcalls. And we don't have a disadvantage when we push directly, cause the calling range which we dominate, like Ace Queen offsuit or Ace Jack suited, or if a fun player wants to call Ace 10 suited or Ace 9 suited, then they call our jam anyway. When we min raise, he maybe wants to see a flop first, so we don't lose the value range of our opponents. The argument that we keep the trash in the hand when we only min raise is questionable, I think, cause where do you want to generate so much EV post flop when you're out of position with 12 or 13 big blinds? And most of the time we play against a range that has 2 live cards, so when we don't hit we have a problem. So I suggest that you min raise 10s plus with 12 big blinds and you min raise the bottom end of your shoving range. And we can do this a bit looser too, especially when middle position, the cutoff and the button are only regulars, cause they are not going to flat our open raise. I want to refer to the preflop course when we should open which ranges, though this makes sense cause Rex flat call very rarely, especially hands like Ace Deuce suited, which are a marginal Nash push. We can steal those hands with a min raise and we can balance our range a bit with this play. When you realize that you have a lot of success with it, you can steal loser. What to do when we get called loser than Nash? Just mark the hand and note with what kind of hand he called you and write behind the adapted shoving range. That's a very good exercise to memorize the ranges. I talked about this point earlier. Create a budget against which position he called loose. You don't have to write into the budget he calls at X blinds this or this hand. The budget is just that you don't forget about, cause most of the time you just play your game, but you're not always looking in the note window. The budgets are as a reminder, cause often you have a hand and you don't want to look in each note window, cause it takes a lot of time. And the budgets just save you a lot of time. As an example, when you are on the cutoff and you have a hand like 6-5 suited, and when villain snapped you with King Deuce suited, then just create a budget, calls loose against late position. And when you are the next time in the same spot You see the budget and you can open your note window to look with which hand at which blind stage he called you. With that, you will not make a mistake in the spot and you can adapt on your opponent, and the next time you have to push tighter. You can do the same thing for blind versus blind. When the situation is reversed and you have to think about calling a push, you can create a budget that reminds you that he is shoving very loose. So you have a no-brainer fold hand, but in the past he shoved 100% range. Then you can call very loose sometimes, and then the no-brainer fold is very easy, a very profitable call. The problem with notes and reads is often, and you experienced this probably before, oh shit, I should have looked in my notes, and you prevent this with the budgets. You also save a lot of time. Now let's talk about the push versus min raise strategy. At first we look into the situation, when should we min raise instead of shoving. When the players behind us are very tight and passive, we can start to min raise, especially with hands that have not a huge EV when we shove them. So hands with 0.1 or 0.2 EV. We should rather min raise those hands cause we can create a higher EV with this play. We can use it for the isolation of shorter stacks. For an example, when we are on the button with 10 to 11 big blinds and the small blind is a fun player with 15 big blinds and in the big blind is a short stack, so we can get it in with our weak range against the big blind, and when the fun player is behind us we don't have to think about balancing. Then we can use it for overtaking the chip lead, and we can min raise a bit lighter, but we have to watch out for good regulars which know what's going on, but there are also a ton of bad regs which don't care and they are way too tight. And we should min raise against players which call too loose. Then we put the bottom end of our shoving range into the min raising range or into our completing range. When villain raises very loose against our complete or 3-bets very loose, then we just play tighter or wall, and we have to pay attention that we don't burn too much money in this spot. And in many spots the min raise generates a higher EV than a push. Then the next question is, when should we push instead of min raise? Of course, against aggressive re-stealers with hands we can't call a re-steal with, so hands like Queen 10 offsuit for 12 big blinds or Jack 10 offsuit or Ace Deuce offsuit, then we should use the direct push even when it's only a marginal plus EV spot. There are also spots in which we have to push 20 big blinds on the bubble cause a min raise call is not profitable and we are the second chip leader. That's an extreme example, but these situations happen sometimes. Another point is when cold call happy players are behind. Let's assume we have 12, 13 big blinds in middle position, and normally I'm a fan of min raising 7 and 8s, but when there are 1 or 2 very passive players which flat call a lot, we should prefer the direct push. Another spot is when you are already the chip leader, and especially when you are a close chip leader. So with our min raise we give the second chip leader the option to overtake the chip lead, and we don't want that. And when you know that this reg is a bit on the aggressive side, then we have to pay attention that we don't raise fold too much. So just shove your marginal hands to increase your chip lead. Often in the small blind with deeper stacks, it's a valid option to push preflop when our opponents defend very loose and aggressive. So even when the preflop min raise is plus EV, it's very hard to play the hand postflop well against an aggressive opponent, and it does not matter if he's a fun player or a regular. cause we can very rarely realize our equity, but you can analyze those spots very good with ICM analyze tools. You look at the EV when we push, and then you look at the EV when we min raise. And now we will look into some example hands together. I selected some hands and we try to analyze what's the best play, the min raise or the push. We have an unknown on the cutoff. It looks like he is a tighter fun player or maybe a regular. The button and the big blind are regulars, but the big blind is very tight. You can see it on his 3-bet stats, and I made a huge mistake. I open shipped this hand cause I don't want to give away my chip lead, cause the big blind can re-steal very loose. But that's just wrong when we look at his 3-bet stats. Let's look into it. At first we look at the EV when we shove with these calling ranges, and I think those ranges are realistic. And we have a close push with ace-5 suited. And when we look at the min-raise EV, I adjusted all the ranges before. We don't know the cutoff too well, so I gave him a loser re-steal range, but he can re-steal tighter too. The button and the big blind are regulars. I don't think that they re-steal lighter. And it's not a good idea to rejam Jack-10 suited against my under the gun range or Queen-10 suited. The big blind is normally tighter, but I gave him a 13% re-steal range. Maybe he is able to see this spot, and we see that we have a V difference of 0.3 in comparison to the push. So it's a huge leak to push this hand in this scenario, even when the big blind is a regular, which realizes the situation and rejams all those hands. Okay, then the ship is a slightly better option. So when there's an aggressive reg and he tries to overtake the chip lead, we should jam preflop. But when you see that he has tight stats, cause when he re-steals only 10%, it's not going to be very profitable to push. Now we can open any two. That's for sure not profitable, cause the regs will adapt when you open any two in this spot. Okay, let's move on to the next hand. We have a player on the cutoff with 2 big blinds and he limps, and we have 2 regulars in the blinds. And I think it should be clear that an ISO raise is way more profitable than the push, cause the cutoff is nearly all in, so the regs cannot bluff re-steal so much, and we should raise to keep the variance low. Let's move on to the next hand. It's similar to the ace-5 suited hand. Especially four-handed, it's important to not take every marginal spot. We have an unknown in the small blind and he can call a lot. I would min raise till pocket fives and the weak aces, hands like king-10 offsuit, jack-10 offsuit, and with that you can save a lot of variance. Let's move on to the next hand. We are four-handed and we have 2 regulars in the blinds. The big blind is a very aggressive reg, and I will show you both situations with the aggressive reg and without him. On the first 700 hands he has aggressive 3-bet stats, and so far he 3-bets 50% against the small blind, and against the button 16%, and against the cutoff 14%. So when he can 3-bet against the second chip leader, he will 3-bet a lot looser than his 16%, and I have a lot of notes on him that he re-stealed very loose. At first we look at the EV when we min raise. I gave the small blind this standard calling range. I think that's solid with his 5-6 big blinds. I don't want to say that this is a very good range, but I think many regs will call this range. And I gave the regular 33% re-steal range. I'm confident that he's able to play this range and it is possible that he bluffs 3-bet some hands and we have to fold against the bluff 3-bet too. So we can add some hands here. He don't have to repush, he can bluff 3-bet too. And when we increase his range to 40%, we see that we have to min raise very tight. When we push preflop, I think this calling range is realistic. He knows that we are capped and he will call ace-9 and ace-10. So we push this range and we min raise call some hands. Yes, and he can call 6s too. Ace-5 is a close push, but we should shove this hand even 15 big blinds deep, cause otherwise he will reshove too often. The good thing is that we overtake the chip lead with this push and we can try to increase our chip lead to abuse the bubble later on. That's why the shove is better than the min raise, so you have to pay attention that you take these close spots against aggro racks. I'm not a huge fan of it, but there is no other way. Even if we limp, he can raise a lot and make our life very tough post-flop. It is important that you understand the reasons when we should shove and when we should min raise. That's not very hard, but it's important that you implement it in your game and that you train it. So train with the calculator or the ICMizer. And as the last point, I will talk about playing short stacked. When we have identical stacks behind, we should shove very, very loose. In the small blind against a fish in the big blind, we should shove 100%. An exception is when villain has an enormous big stack, or when we are even with our 5-6 big blinds on the bubble. So there's another short stack and one enormous big stack, so we can shove only 40-50% range, cause we're even with the other short stack. There are situations in which other racks push way too loose, cause they think I have only 5 or 6 big blinds, but we don't have to get into those minus EV situations, cause the other player is also there. We have just to hope that we win the folding war, but it is important how many plus EV spots do we get in the future. So against which stacks I was shoving in the next hands. You may remember the 10-7 offsuit hand when we had 500 chips with 120 blinds. This was a very good example, because after that we have to push into short stacks and they have to call very light, cause they get so good odds. Or are enough big stacks there and we don't have to push right now, so keep an eye on the future game. Now I want to talk about another important point when we can shove against other big stacks. I see very tight folds and I don't understand that, cause many racks are calling tighter than Nash. In contrast to the fish, the regular tries to protect their big stack and it makes sense. We don't need to take every close plus EV spot when we are the big stack. Many big stacks try to bring their big stack to the bubble, so it is important that you shove your normal range also against the big stacks, maybe even a bit looser than normal. It's often more profitable than the Nash range when you push a bit looser against the other big stacks racks. Let's assume we have a minus EV spot of 0.2 or 0.3, then we have to ask ourselves, do we get a better spot in the future? And that's often not the case, because after that many spots are minus EV. I want to show you this very quick on this example. We have a regular which shoves in the small blind. I gave him the Nash range 92%, but that's regular dependent. Some push any two, some racks are a bit tighter, cause we will call loser, cause we are so short. We just assume he's shoving the Nash range, and according to Nash we can call Jack-6 offsuit. The question we have to ask ourselves is, do we get a better spot in the next hands? And I doubt that. That's why we should call with Jack 5, because after that we are in the small blind and we can't call that loose, and we can't shove that light on the button cause they will call super light because the odds are so good. And after that we're in the big blind with 300 chips, and I think it is clear that our situation is not getting better. So when we play against the small blind, Jack high is a good hand. It's another spot when we decrease his stack size, so when we are closer to the other short stack, then we have a realistic chance that he is busting before us, or when we double up we have way more chips than he does. The problem now is when we double up we are only even, so the situation is different when he has 2 big blinds less. In this spot we have to call tighter, cause our equity on the overall prize pool increases. I think you should know this concept. And we see we can call Jack 7 then, but you can see that our calling range gets tighter. It's just important that you look what happens in the next 1 or 2 hands, and when you see your situation gets worse, just take the close minus EV call or minus EV push. And I'm not a fan of doing hours of future game simulations. You can do it with the Hold'em resource calculator, and I like the function and you should have used it, but I think there are a ton of more important spots and spots in which you can gain more money. Those spots are not mathematical solved now. There are different strategies. The one player does not like taking minus EV spots. The other player is extremely loose because he wants to keep his full equity. So many players have different playing styles and all of them are successful, but I think we should do these loose calls and loose pushes. We shouldn't exaggerate it, we just have to estimate the situation. You'll make some mistakes, but everyone does it, and these are very tough spots. And when you get very often in these situations, look if you're losing too many chips in other situations. Cause in this Falling War spot, most of the time, the poker god decides who wins and who don't. Oh, what I meant with shove very loose against identical stacks is that we can shove a bit looser than the Nash range. And I know that the Nash range is loose to like the 10-7 hand in the beginning. You can rewind cause that's a very good example for this point. So look into the future, look against which stacks you have to shove in the next hands. That's the most important thing. Okay, so the most important thing is always to consider your stack in relation to the blinds. Keep your ranges flexible and don't always push according to Nash. Under 10 big blinds you can push very loose, and against the fish often any 2 when the stack from the fun player is not too huge. In general, you should avoid the confrontation with other big stacks. That's general a rule for sit and go poker. But watch out that they don't abuse you and steal too much against you. But I talk about this in my restealing video. And yeah, learn how to implement a min raising strategy. You will save a lot of EV. Apart from that, I can just say train, train, train. It's important that you understand the theory behind certain spots where you do some things. Often it's not that complicated, sometimes it's very simple, but it is important to recognize the important factors and don't forget about it on the tables. So mark many hands and review the hands after the session or before your next session, and just play a bit with your ranges. I talked about it in my resteal video too. The shoving is the most important thing for a sit and go player, cause it's the longest stage and ICM plays an important role. That should be your daily work before each session to look at a few ranges. That's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot. I wish you a lot of success at the tables, and I say goodbye. This was Ben CB. and I will see you next time.